The forest was burning, and Kira could feel the heat at her back as she ran through the twisted trees with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She held 2 infant dragons against her body and wrapped them in the thick fabric of her cloak to protect them from the smoke that filled the air like a gray curtain. The babies cried out in fear, and their small voices cut through the sound of flames, crackling and branches falling all around them. Behind her, she could hear the hunters shouting to each other, and their boots crashed through the undergrowth. Without care or silence, they had found the nest at dawn and destroyed it with fire and explosives because they wanted the dragon eggs for the black market, where collectors paid fortunes for illegal creatures. Kira had arrived too late to save the mother dragon, who lay dead near the burning trees with her beautiful blue scales now covered in ash and blood. But she had found these 2 babies hiding in a hollow log, and she grabbed them and started running before the poachers could spot her. She was an elf, and her people had bonded with dragons for thousands of years in a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. The dragons helped elves with their magic and strength, while elves protected dragon nests and raised abandoned younglings. But something had changed in recent decades, and greed had infected some of her own kind. Now there were elves who worked with human poachers and sold dragon parts to the highest bidder. Kira felt sick thinking about it, because her entire life had been dedicated to preserving the ancient bond, and watching it crumble broke her heart. The silver dragon in her arms was a female with delicate scales that caught the light even through the smoke. Her brother had golden markings along his spine and tiny horns that had just begun to emerge from his head. Both were barely a week old and still needed constant care to survive. Without their mother, they would die within days unless Kira could get them somewhere safe. But she was running out of options because the hunters had tracked her across 3 provinces, and they would not give up as long as these valuable babies remained alive. A weapon blast scorched the tree next to her head, and Kira threw herself sideways to avoid the second shot. The dragon screamed, and she whispered soothing words in the old language, even though her own fear made her voice shake. She could not fight the hunters because there were too many of them, and they had advanced technology while she only had her knowledge of the forest and her desperate need to protect these innocent lives. Through the trees ahead, she saw something that made her stumble in shock. There was a portal shimmering in the air between 2 ancient oaks, and it glowed with unstable energy that flickered and pulsed like a living thing. Portals were rare and dangerous, and this one had appeared without warning in a place where no portal should exist. Kira knew the stories about random portals that opened between dimensions and led to unknown worlds where travelers might never return, but she also knew that staying here meant certain death for her and the babies. She made her decision in half a second and ran straight toward the portal while another weapon blast burned past her shoulder. The hunters saw where she was going, and their leader screamed for them to shoot her before she escaped. Energy bolts lit up the forest, and one struck a branch that crashed down inches from Kira's feet. She leaped over it and kept running with the dragons held tight against her chest and their small hearts beating fast like tiny drums. The portal grew larger as she approached, and she could see swirling colors inside it like oil on water. There was no time to think about where it might lead or what dangers waited on the other side. Kira took a deep breath and jumped through the gateway with her eyes squeezed shut and her arms wrapped around the babies to shield them from whatever came next. Reality twisted and pulled at her body like she was being stretched in every direction at once. The dragons shrieked, and Kira felt dizzy as colors and shapes blurred together into meaningless chaos. Her stomach lurched, and for a terrible moment she thought she might be torn apart by the forces ripping through the portal. Then suddenly everything stopped and she was falling through normal space again. She hit a hard metal floor with a painful thud that knocked the air from her lungs. The dragons tumbled from her grasp and slid across the smooth surface until they bumped into something solid. Kira gasped and tried to push herself up on shaking arms while her vision slowly cleared, and her brain struggled to understand what she was seeing. She was in a large room made of metal and strange lights and machinery that hummed with power. The air smelled different here, like chemicals and recycled atmosphere instead of forest and smoke. Behind her, the portal flickered once and then vanished with a soft pop that left only empty air. Kira realized with growing horror that she was trapped wherever this place was with no way to go back home. The silver dragon baby started crying, and the sound was so pitiful that Kira forgot her own fear for a moment and crawled across the metal floor to gather both infants back into her arms. They were terrified and confused, and she could feel them trembling against her body. She checked them quickly for injuries and felt relief when she found only minor bumps and scrapes. The portal journey had been rough, but they had survived it together. A door opened somewhere behind her with a mechanical hiss, and Kira spun around while trying to shield the dragons with her body. Her pointed ears caught the sound of footsteps approaching and voices speaking in a language she did not recognize at first. Then her translation magic kicked in, and the strange sounds resolved into words she could understand. They were humans, and they sounded surprised and confused, but not immediately hostile. 3. Humans entered the cargo bay and stopped short when they saw her sitting on the floor with 2 dragon babies in her arms. The first was a woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a blue uniform with badges and symbols that meant nothing to Kira. The woman's eyes went wide and her mouth opened in shock, but she did not reach for a weapon or shout for help. Instead, she raised both hands slowly in what seemed like a peaceful gesture. The second human was a man with brown skin and kind eyes, and he had tools hanging from his belt that marked him as some kind of engineer or mechanic. He knelt down at a respectful distance and stared at the dragons with an expression of pure wonder on his face. The third was a younger woman with red hair and freckles, and she kept glancing nervously at the spot where the portal had been, as if expecting more trouble to come through at any moment. The dark-haired woman spoke first, and her voice was calm and measured, like she was trying not to startle a wounded animal. She asked Kira if she was injured and if she needed medical attention. Kira understood the words but struggled to form a response because her throat was tight with stress and exhaustion. She shook her head and pulled the dragons closer, while watching the humans carefully for any sign of danger. The male dragon hissed at the strangers and tried to look threatening, even though he was barely bigger than a small cat. His sister whimpered and buried her face against Kira's chest. The engineer smiled gently and said something about them being scared and needing food and warmth. He pulled out a small device and spoke into it while requesting supplies and a heated room. Kira felt confusion wash over her, because these humans were acting nothing like the stories she had been told. In her world, humans were known as aggressive and greedy creatures who took what they wanted, without caring about the consequences. They hunted endangered species and destroyed natural habitats and fought endless wars over resources and territory. Elves had learned long ago to avoid human settlements and keep their existence secret from human governments. But these 3 humans in front of her seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being and the safety of the infant dragons. The dark-haired woman introduced herself as Captain Phillips and explained that they were aboard a cargo ship called the Betty Ann. She said they ran supplies between colonies and had been doing routine maintenance when an alarm alerted them to an unauthorized portal opening in their cargo bay. Phillips spoke slowly and clearly and made sure Kira understood each word before continuing. She asked where Kira had come from and what had happened to make her flee through a dangerous portal. Kira took a shaky breath and tried to explain about the hunters and the destroyed nest and her desperate need to save these last 2 survivors of an ancient bloodline. The words came out broken and jumbled because speaking the human language was difficult when she was this exhausted and scared. But Captain Phillips listened patiently and nodded at the right moments, and her expression grew more serious as she understood the situation. The young woman with red hair, whose name tag said Monroe, asked if the people chasing Kira could follow through the portal. Kira shook her head and explained that random portals were unstable and usually collapsed after one use. There was no way for the hunters to track her now, but that also meant she had no way to go back home. She was stranded in this strange place with 2 helpless babies and no resources, and no plan for what to do next. The engineer, whose name was Torres, stood up and said they needed to get the little ones somewhere warm and safe immediately. Baby dragons required specific temperature ranges and proper nutrition, or they would sicken and die within hours. Kira felt her eyes burning with tears because she knew he was right, and she had nothing to give them. She had acted on pure instinct when she jumped through the portal, and now she had to face the reality that she might have saved them from poachers only to watch them die slowly from neglect. Captain Phillips made a decision with the kind of quick authority that spoke of years in command. She told her crew to escort their guest to the spare cabin and set up everything needed for the dragon's care. They would sort out all the complicated details later after everyone had eaten and rested. Monroe moved forward carefully and offered to carry one of the babies if Kira was too tired. Kira hesitated because dragons were precious and she did not know if she could trust these strangers with something so valuable. But the silver dragon had started to shiver despite the warm air in the cargo bay, and Kira knew she needed help whether she wanted to admit it or not. She carefully handed the female baby to Monroe and watched closely as the young woman cradled her with gentle hands and soft words. They led Kira through narrow corridors that curved and branched in ways that made no sense to her forest-trained mind. Everything was metal and artificial light and the constant hum of machinery that vibrated through the walls. She kept the male dragon clutched against her chest while Monroe walked beside her, carrying his silver sister with surprising care. Torres moved ahead to prepare the cabin, while Captain Phillips stayed behind to deal with the portal, aftermath, and file reports with whoever ran this vessel. The spare cabin turned out to be a small storage room that had been cleared of boxes and equipment. Torres had already set up heating lamps in 2 corners and spread thick blankets on the floor to create a soft nest. He was adjusting temperature controls on a wall panel when they entered, and he smiled at Kira with genuine warmth that caught her off guard. He explained that the room would stay at exactly the right temperature for infant dragons, and he had requested food supplies that should arrive within minutes. Kira sank down onto the blankets and felt exhaustion crash over her like a physical weight. She had been running on pure adrenaline for hours, and now that she was finally somewhere safe, her body wanted to shut down completely. The male dragon squirmed in her arms and made unhappy chirping sounds that meant he was hungry and uncomfortable. Monroe gently set his sister down next to him, and the 2 babies immediately curled together for comfort, while their little tails wrapped around each other. Torres left and returned quickly with metal containers that steamed and smelled of cooked meat. He opened them carefully and used tongs to pull out chunks of protein that he cut into smaller pieces suitable for dragon mouths. Kira watched in amazement as he tested the temperature with his finger and blew on the hot pieces to cool them down before offering them to the hungry babies. The silver female sniffed cautiously and then began eating with desperate speed while her brother watched the humans with suspicious eyes. Monroe knelt down and spoke softly to the male dragon and told him the food was safe and delicious. She held out a small piece and waited patiently until curiosity and hunger finally overcame his fear. He snatched the meat from her fingers and swallowed it whole before demanding more with insistent chirps. Torres laughed and said the little guy had spirit and would grow up to be magnificent if they could keep him fed and healthy. Kira felt tears sliding down her cheeks, and she could not stop them even though crying in front of strangers felt shameful and weak. These humans had not hesitated to help even though they knew nothing about her and had no reason to trust an elf with dangerous creatures. They treated the dragons like they were precious and worth protecting, instead of valuable commodities to be sold. Monroe noticed Kira's tears and moved closer to put a gentle hand on her shoulder while murmuring that everything would be okay. Now, the dragons ate until their tiny bellies were round and full, and then they curled up together on the warm blankets and fell asleep within seconds. Their small chests rose and fell with steady breathing, and occasionally one would twitch or make soft sounds from whatever dreams filled their infant minds. Kira watched them sleep and felt her own exhaustion pulling at her, but she was afraid to close her eyes in this strange place. Captain Phillips arrived an hour later carrying a tray with soup and bread and hot tea that smelled of herbs Kira did not recognize. She sat down on a metal crate and handed the food to Kira while explaining that the crew wanted to help in any way possible. Phillips said she had sent messages to her contacts asking about sanctuary worlds where dragons were protected and species worked together in peace. There were places in human space where endangered creatures could live safely without fear of poachers or exploitation. Kira ate the soup slowly and felt warmth spreading through her cold, tired body. She asked Phillips why humans would help an elf and her dragons when their 2 species had such a difficult history. The captain looked thoughtful for a moment and then said that not all humans were the same, just like not all elves were the same. Some people chose greed and violence while others chose compassion and protection. The crew of the Betty Ann had signed on because they believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard or dangerous or unprofitable. Phillips asked gentle questions about Kira's world and the situation with the poachers, and how dragon populations had declined so dramatically. Kira found herself talking about things she had never shared with outsiders before. She explained how some elves had betrayed the ancient bonds for money and status. She described the underground markets where dragon parts sold for fortunes, and collectors kept living dragons in cages as exotic pets. She talked about the mother dragon, who had died protecting her nest, and how these two babies were the last of their bloodline. The captain listened, without judgment or interruption, and her expression grew darker as she understood the full scope of the problem. When Kira finished talking, Phillips was quiet for a long moment before saying that evil existed in every species and every world. But goodness existed too in people who fought against cruelty and injustice. The crew of the Betty Ann might not be able to solve all the problems facing dragons and elves, but they could protect these two innocent lives and give them a chance to grow up safe and healthy. Kira asked what would happen next and whether she was a prisoner or a guest. Philip smiled and said she was definitely a guest and could stay as long as she needed, while they figured out a permanent solution. The ship was heading toward a colony world where they had to deliver supplies, and the journey would take several weeks. That gave them time to research sanctuaries and make contacts and prepare proper documentation for Kira and the dragons. Monroe returned with more blankets and a change of clothes for Kira because her own garments were torn and stained with smoke and blood. Torres brought toys he had made from spare parts, including jingling balls and soft fabric shapes that dragons could chase and pounce on. Kira watched these humans fuss over the sleeping babies and felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. The days aboard the Betty Ann fell into a rhythm that surprised Kira with its comfortable normalcy. She woke each morning to find Torres already in the cabin adjusting temperature controls and preparing breakfast for the dragons. He had researched dragon nutrition using the ship's database and found protein supplements that helped the babies grow stronger and healthier. The engineer sang silly songs while he worked, and the dragons had started recognizing his voice and chirping excitedly when he entered the room. The silver female, who Kira had named Luna after the moonlight color of her scales, had become bold and curious about everything around her. She explored every corner of the cabin and tried to climb the walls using her tiny claws. Monroe brought her new toys almost daily, and Luna loved batting them around while making happy trilling sounds. She had figured out how to glide short distances by spreading her small wings and launching herself from elevated surfaces. Torres built her a climbing structure from spare parts so she could practice her skills safely. Her brother Apollo, named for his golden markings, was more cautious and thoughtful in his approach to the world. He bonded strongly with Torres and would curl up in the engineer's lap during quiet moments while making purring sounds. Apollo watched everything carefully before trying it himself, and he seemed to understand that patience and observation led to better results than Luna's reckless enthusiasm. But when he did decide to try something new, he mastered it quickly with focused determination. Other crew members started visiting the cabin during their breaks to see the dragons and bring gifts. A man named Chen, who worked in the galley, brought special treats he had cooked using recipes he found in old Earth databases. A woman called Rodriguez from navigation taught Kira about star charts and explained how ships traveled between worlds using jump points and faster-than-light drives. Even the ship's doctor, whose name was William, stopped by to check on everyone's health and make sure the dragons were developing properly. Kira learned that the Betty Ann had a crew of 23 humans who came from different worlds and cultures across human space. They were not wealthy or powerful, but they worked hard and treated each other with respect and humor. Captain Phillips ran the ship with fair authority and listened to her crew's concerns before making decisions. The humans laughed easily and told stories during meals and helped each other solve problems without keeping score of who owed what favors. It was so different from what Kira had expected based on the stories her people told about humans. She had been taught that humans were violent and selfish and only cared about profit and conquest. But these humans cared deeply about doing good work and protecting innocent lives and treating others with kindness. They had welcomed an elf stranger and two dangerous creatures onto their ship without asking for payment or guarantees. They spent their free time researching dragon care and building toys and making sure everyone felt safe and comfortable. Luna started flying longer distances, and her confidence grew every day. She would launch herself from the climbing structure and glide across the cabin to land on Kira's shoulder or Torres's head. Apollo took longer to attempt flight, but when he finally spread his wings and lifted off the floor, his control and grace surpassed his sister's wild enthusiasm. The two dragons played together constantly, and their bond grew stronger as they learned to communicate. Through chirps and trills and body language, Captain Phillips kept her promise about finding a sanctuary, and after 2 weeks, she called Kira to her office to share good news. She had made contact with a facility on a world called Haven, that specialized in protecting endangered species from across the galaxy. The sanctuary was run by a mixed-species coalition including humans and elves and several other races who believed in preservation and cooperation. They had space for Luna and Apollo and experience raising dragons from infancy to adulthood. They also had positions available for dragon handlers, and Kira could work there if she wanted to stay with the babies. Kira felt relief and sadness mixing together in her chest because while she was grateful for the opportunity, she would miss the crew of the Betty Ann who had become like family. Philip seemed to understand and said the ship made regular runs to Haven Sector so they could visit and check on how everyone was doing. Torres already made Kira promise to send him updates and videos of the dragons learning to fly and hunt. Monroe had tears in her eyes when she heard they would be leaving soon, but she smiled and said she was happy they would have a real home. The journey to Haven took another week, and during that time Kira taught the crew basic dragon care techniques and shared stories about her world and the ancient bond between elves and dragons. She learned more about human culture and technology, and realized that her people had been wrong to isolate themselves and view humans as enemies. There were bad humans just like there were bad elves, but there were also good ones who fought for justice and protected the weak and chose compassion over cruelty. Luna and Apollo grew bigger and stronger with each passing day. Their scales became more vibrant and their wings developed better muscle control. They could fly across the entire cargo bay now when Torres brought them there for exercise. The crew gathered to watch them practice aerial maneuvers, and everyone cheered when Apollo managed his first loop, and Luna caught a thrown toy in mid-air. The dragons had gone from terrified refugees to confident youngsters in just a few weeks thanks to the constant care and attention they received. On the last night before reaching Haven, the entire crew gathered in the galley for a special dinner. Chen had prepared an elaborate meal with dishes from a dozen different worlds and cultures. Torres presented Kira with a datapad containing all his research on dragon care, along with photos and videos of Luna and Apollo growing up. Monroe gave her a handmade scarf with embroidered dragons flying across a starry sky. Other crew members brought gifts and shared memories and made Kira promise to stay in touch. Haven appeared on the view screen as a green and blue jewel hanging in space with 3 small moons orbiting in graceful patterns. Kira stood on the bridge next to Captain Phillips and watched the planet grow larger as the Betty Ann descended through the atmosphere. She held Luna on her left shoulder and Apollo on her right, and both dragons made excited chirping sounds as they saw the world that would become their new home. The sanctuary was located in a temperate region with rolling hills and forests, and clear rivers that sparkled in the sunlight. The main facility was built into a hillside using natural materials that blended with the landscape instead of dominating it. Landing pads were arranged in a circle around a central courtyard where Kira could see other creatures moving about, including several adult dragons whose scales gleamed in colors she had never seen before. A woman with silver hair and pointed ears waited at the landing pad, and Kira felt her breath catch because she had not expected to see another elf here. The woman introduced herself as Director Vale and said she had been running the sanctuary for 30 years after leaving their homeworld for many of the same reasons Kira had fled. Vale explained that she had grown tired of watching her people destroy what they claimed to protect and decided to do something practical about saving endangered species. Vale knelt down to examine Luna and Apollo with experienced eyes and pronounced them healthy and well cared for. She complimented Torres on his research and nutrition planning and thanked Captain Phillips for bringing them safely across space. The director said she had prepared a habitat specifically designed for young dragons, with plenty of room to fly and climb and explore. There were other younglings at the sanctuary who could teach Luna and Apollo how to hunt and develop their natural abilities. Torres carried his equipment down the ramp and spent an hour setting up the habitat exactly right while explaining everything to the sanctuary staff. He showed them his temperature logs and feeding schedules and exercise routines with the kind of detailed care that made Kira's heart ache. When he finally ran out of instructions, he knelt down and hugged both dragons gently, while whispering that they needed to be good and grow strong and remember him. Apollo chirped sadly and rubbed his head against Torres's chest while Luna tried to climb into his pocket. Monroe gave Kira a long hug and made her promise to send messages regularly with updates and photos. She had grown attached to Luna especially, and watching the little dragon fly off to explore her new home brought tears that she did not try to hide. Chen pressed a container of frozen treats into Kira's hands and said the dragons would love them once they thawed. Rodriguez gave her a star chart showing all the routes between Haven and the Betty Ann's regular shipping lanes so Kira would know when they might visit. Captain Phillips walked with Kira to the habitat area and they stood watching Luna and Apollo investigate their new surroundings with typical dragon curiosity. Phillips said she was proud of her crew for stepping up to help when it mattered and doing the right thing without expecting rewards. She admitted that having Kira and the dragons aboard had reminded everyone why they chose this life of traveling between stars and meeting new species and learning that the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than any single perspective could capture. Kira felt words sticking in her throat because how could she possibly express the depth of her gratitude to these humans who had saved 3 lives without hesitation? She tried to explain that they had given her more than just shelter and safety. They had given her hope that different species could work together in trust and friendship. They had shown her that kindness was not limited by biology or culture and that choosing to care about others was what made someone truly civilized regardless of what planet they came from. The captain smiled and said that was the best payment they could receive. Because money came and went, but knowing you made a real difference in someone's life stayed with you forever. She promised that Betty Ann would return in 3 months on their next scheduled run, and they would check on everyone's progress. Torres had already started planning what new toys to bring, and Monroe was researching dragon games she could teach them on the next visit. The crew returned to their ship, and Kira stood on the landing pad with Director Vale watching the Betty Ann lift off and climb back toward the stars. Luna and Apollo pressed against her legs and made questioning sounds as if asking where their friends were going. Kira told them the humans would come back soon, and in the meantime, they had a whole new world to explore and learn about together. The following weeks were busy with settling into sanctuary, routines, and helping Luna and Apollo adjust to their new environment. There were 6 other young dragons at the facility, and they quickly became friends through the universal language of play and competition. An older dragon named Ember, who had beautiful copper scales, took the youngsters under her wing and taught them proper flying techniques and hunting skills. Luna threw herself into every lesson with fearless energy while Apollo observed carefully before attempting new skills with methodical precision. Kira started working as a dragon handler and discovered she had natural talent for understanding dragon behavior and communication. Director Vale put her in charge of the younger dragons, and she spent her days teaching them and playing with them, and making sure they grew up healthy and confident. She also helped with rescue operations when the sanctuary received reports of dragons in danger elsewhere in the galaxy. It felt good to be doing work that mattered and making a real difference in preserving the species she had loved since childhood. 3 months passed quickly, filled with hard work and new friendships and the satisfaction of watching Luna and Apollo thrive in their safe haven. When the Betty Ann returned, Torres barely waited for the landing ramp to lower before rushing out to see how much the dragons had grown. They were twice their original size now, with stronger wings and brighter scales, and they recognized him immediately despite the time apart. Apollo flew straight to his shoulder, and Luna did a celebratory loop in the air before landing on Torres's head. The crew stayed for 2 days and brought gifts and stories and laughter that filled the sanctuary with joy. Chen taught the kitchen staff his special dragon treat recipe, and Rodriguez helped upgrade the facility's communication system so they could send messages more easily. Monroe played flying games with all the young dragons until she was exhausted and happy. Captain Phillips met with Director Vale to discuss cooperation between the sanctuary and the shipping company, including regular supply runs and intelligence sharing about poaching activities. On the last evening before departure, they gathered around a fire in the courtyard and shared a meal under the stars. Kira looked around at the mix of humans and elves and other species, all working together to protect innocent lives, and she felt grateful beyond words. Luna and Apollo curled up together near the fire with full bellies and tired wings, already falling asleep after a day of showing off for their favorite humans. Torres caught Kira's eye and smiled, and she knew he understood what she was thinking. Sometimes the universe brought people together in unexpected ways and created families that had nothing to do with blood or species. The crew of the Betty Ann had taught her that courage came in many forms, including the simple choice to help a stranger without asking what you would get in return. And that lesson would stay with her forever, just like the memory of the day desperate elf had fallen through a portal carrying 2 dragon babies and found humans waiting with open arms and generous hearts, ready to shelter them through the storm.